My name is Penpat Sereng, and I am the democratically elected leader of the Tibetans in exile. Since His Holiness the Dalai Lama devolved his political and administrative responsibilities in 2011, we have been having direct election of the elected leaders since 2001. Since 2001 to 2010, His Holiness has been saying that I'm semi-retired. In 2011, he devolved all his responsibilities, both administrative and political, and I am the third in a sense, starting from 12 to 11, but my predecessor served for 10 years. This is my first term, and this is my second visit to Gangtok as Sikyong, or the democratically elected leader of the Tibetan people. Now, since we assumed office, that was also the time when pandemic was raging, and the world was looking at China in a different way. So even though we follow what is called as the middle way policy proposed by His Holiness Dalai Lama to seek a non-violent, negotiated, mutually beneficial solution that would be lasting, and we are committed to following this policy that His Holiness has proposed and also approved unanimously by the Tibetan Parliament in exile. We decided to change the strategy a little bit, because when we say middle way, then you also talk about the extremes or the polarities. Without recognition to the polarities, there is no value for the middle way. So in the political sense, one polarity is the present situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese communist government, and the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. The one polarity, the situation inside Tibet, which I keep saying that we are dying a slow death, and that cultural genocide is happening inside Tibet. We often get asked question as to why people don't get to hear much about Tibet these days. That is because if people have read George Orwell's 1984, it's more like George Orwell's 1984 coming into reality in the whole of China, and more particularly in Tibet, where the state surveils and controls all the population. And right now, under the present dispensation of President Xi Jinping, all the policies of the Chinese government are aimed at eradication of the identity of all the nationalities. Unfortunately, the whole world is moving towards multiculturalism, but China is the only country that's moving towards uniculturalism, where the president is aiming for the whole nation to speak only one language, that's Mandarin Chinese language. And in Tibet, particularly, those of you who are in the know, would vouch also for the report that was done by the special rapporteurs on Tibet that talked about the colonial-style boarding schools in Tibet. Students between the age of 6 to 18, more than 1 million out of 7.3 million Tibetans inside Tibet, are now being forced into boarding schools where they have to study Mandarin language. They have to study Communist Party thought, Xi Jinping thought, and their loyalty to the Communist Party and all that. So in terms of language, Tibetan language, which comes from the Tibetan script, which comes from India in the 7th century, which has nothing to do with Chinese language. And Tibetan language today is considered one among the 15 oldest languages in this world. And we have transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text from 9th century to 13th century into Tibetan, and Tibetan is the only language where you can really study the essence of Buddhism. And that is being targeted because that is the root of Tibetan identity. And then, of course, the Tibetan Buddhism, when Tibet was independent, you had these big monasteries with thousands of monks and nuns. Now it is reduced to 300, 400 in those big monasteries. The number of monks and nuns have come down drastically. Independent Tibet, monks and nuns could move from one place to another place at their own will. But today, for monks and nuns, you need at least 4 or 5 different permits to travel from one place to another to preach. That becomes much more difficult. And then the management of the monasteries have been taken over by the United Front Work Department and the multiple intelligence departments, both national and regional level. And now the communist government, who does not believe in any religion, also wants to be responsible for setting up curriculum for Buddhist studies in Tibet. And the last nail on the coffin is the law they passed in 2007 called the Order Number 5, which talks about the atheist government being responsible for recognition of reincarnated lamas, what Chinese call as living Buddhas. So this is aimed at the yet to come 15th Dalai Lama, because they know that if they can control the next reincarnation of this Dalai Lama, they can control the Tibetan people. So they have been preparing for the demise of this Dalai Lama for a very, very long time. And today His Holiness keeps saying, whenever there are long life prayer offerings, that I would live for another 2 decades and more. And there were propitious pre-signs that this Dalai Lama would live very long. And I tell the Chinese, this message is for you, because you are waiting for this Dalai Lama to die, but this Dalai Lama keeps saying, I'll live long. Let's see whether His Holiness the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party or the Communist Party outlives the Dalai Lama. Now with this background, not just on Tibetan language or Tibetan religion or culture or Tibetan environment, way of life, everything is being disrupted. That is why I keep saying that we are being squeezed like by a python, and out of our breath. So we are dying a slow death, culturally, linguistically. The Tibetan identity is being destroyed. So with that in mind and the international political scenario in mind, we changed our strategy a little bit by focusing on the polarities, because what is happening inside Tibet, we keep telling the international community, but the historical status of Tibet is not much focused on. So now there are 4 reasons why we do this. One is to send a clear message to China that they cannot change history. Chinese leaders, just on their whims and fancies, cannot change history, because history is in the past. When His Holiness was also put this condition that His Holiness should say Tibet was part of China, His Holiness said that I'm a Buddhist monk, I cannot lie. And also the fact that His Holiness also says that I'm not a historian. Let's leave history to historians. That is one message for the Chinese leadership, that they cannot change history. And the second message is for the international community, because the Chinese government asks every government to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. And then all these countries, at the behest of the Chinese government, keeps repeating the statement. So these days we tell the international community that if you keep repeating this statement, you are going against international law, because we have only one agreement with the Chinese, with the Communist Party, that is the 17-point agreement. That was also forced upon us on the threat of war. And the invasion of Tibet in 1950 also was by force. So under international law, it should be null and void. What is happening in Ukraine today with Russia's invasion and what happened to Tibet 74 years ago was the same case. It's the same international law. There's only one international law after Second World War and formation of United Nations and definition of modern nation state. And that is why we tell the international community, please read Tibetan history. That's why I carry two books with me these days. One is by Michael van Praag. He's an expert on international law. And he looked at Tibetan history from a legal perspective. And he correlated the comparative Tibetan history, not just by studying Tibetan history, but also working with about 100 scholars from Central Asia, and establishes the fact that whether it was Tibet Yuan, which is Mongols, when Mongols ruled China from 1271 to 1368, or the relation between Pomodruba, Rinpoche, and Devasangpa dynasties in Tibet for more than 300 years, when China was ruled by the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644. And 2 years before that, in 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama took over the political and temporal leadership of Tibet in 1642. 2 years after that, the Mings were overthrown by the Qings in China. Qings are also Manchus, not Chinese. So looking at all these comparative history and also based on international law, he proves that Tibet has never been considered part of China. And then there is a Chinese professor called Professor Lau. He was always intrigued by this question as to why Chinese government is asking, when he was in his university days, as to why Chinese government is asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC, if what China has been saying, that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. If Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, then why is Chinese government asking governments to say Tibet is part of PRC today? So then he became a professor. He spent all his life as an academic, and he retired, and then he downloaded all the imperial Chinese historical records from the Communist Party website. And now he has come out with a book in Chinese, which has already been translated into Tibetan. An English version will come out in the next 3 months, where he proves that imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. So these two books I carry, and I ask governments to read the books and then make a decision. Without reading Tibetan history, how can you make a decision at the behest of Chinese government? So when they say Tibet is part of PRC, they are trying to give legitimacy to the Chinese government. Then on the other hand, they keep saying, we support negotiations between the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. So I keep telling them, you are contradicting yourself. Because when every country keeps repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, then there is a reason for China to come and talk to us. You are removing the very ground for negotiation. Yeah. Then the third reason we tell them is, why is Chinese government asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC? Why not East Turkestan? Why not Manchuria? Why not Southern Mongolia? Or Inner Mongolia from China's perspective? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet, and they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community. So even now, when I make a statement from here, if there is a response from the Chinese spokesperson in Beijing, they would say, oh, the Tibetan government in exile is not recognized by any country in this world. That is how they try to prove legitimacy. When they don't have, they try to seek that from the international community. So this is also one of the reasons to send a message to the international community about seeking some recognition for the Tibetan historical status. Then the third reason is, of course, for the Tibetans themselves. Now we are only about 130, 140,000 Tibetans in exile. If Tibetans don't study Tibetan history, then who will? Who else will? And the fourth reason is also within the Tibetan community you have, of course, the official position of middle way, and then you have, independent seekers. So we keep saying we can work together. When on the middle way, to gain leverage and value for middle way, if we can focus on the history of Tibet, then independent seekers, those who seek independence for future, will have to prove the independent nature of Tibet in the past. So it doesn't help arguing amongst the Tibetans. What we need to do is convince the Chinese government and convince the international community about our status. So that's how we are trying to work with this Central Tibetan administration. This is the 16th cabinet, of the Central Tibet. And we were not just doing the talk, we have been walking the talk. So we have been working with the US Congress over the last 2 years, and we got this act called the Resolve Tibet Act passed this July, signed by President Joe Biden into a law. Because the United States is the only country that has a law on Tibet, and it talks about 4 major issues in this new law. One issue is that Chinese government keeps saying that there is no Tibet problem, there is no Tibet issue. This law says that Tibet is yet an unresolved conflict, and it needs to be resolved under international law. And the second point is this law says that Tibetan people have the right to self-determination. And self-determination is defined under international law, not autonomy. So this is very much in line with the UN General Assembly resolution of 1961 on Tibet. And then the third angle, which is the most important from our perspective, is that the US government says that they do not recognize China's narrative that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. And then the fourth part of this law talks about the territory of Tibet, because China designs only Tibet autonomous region as Tibet, whereas this law says Tibet consists of all the 3 provinces of Tibet, which is about 2.5 million square kilometers, or a quarter of China's landmass. So this is where we are now. We just concluded, we all witnessed what happened in the US elections, and former President Trump would be coming back next year, January. So there will be, every country has been doing a lot of studies if such things happen. So it's a very fluid and dynamic situation that we are watching internationally, what is happening inside China, and also what's happening inside Tibet. So based on those things, we make our strategies and move forward internationally. And with this law in the United States, now we have to look at the possibilities of working with the US Congress or the State Department, whether they would be able to, or they will be willing to share some shoulder or responsibilities with us to reach out to other countries to adopt similar positions. And that's where we are. Thank you for coming.